And we are back with the fourth segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this fourth segment, we are going to be looking at some fantasy basketball trends and some of the four huge draft trends that you need to know about for this season, at least, according to ESPN. And I'm going to weigh in my own opinions on it as well. And this was an article made by Steve Alexander. Steve, that's a funny name. And obviously, when you're drafting a player and when you're drafting a player in fantasy, there are a lot of things that you have to consider. Fantasy is all about production. So, you have to pick the players that you feel are going to bring the most production to a team, both offensively and defensively. That's how I look at it. So this article starts off by saying if you get a top 4 pick or go last. And essentially those top 4 picks, at least according to this article, are Victor Wembanyama, Nikola Jokic, Luka Doncic, and SGA. And to that, I say yes, those players are fantastic picks in fantasy. And if you can get Nikola Jokic or Luka Doncic, you should definitely try to do that. And a lot of people are expecting a breakout year for Victor. So it might be a little bit of a risk, but I do think that Victor is a very solid option to pick. And as well as SGA. However, I do feel like Giannis Antetokounmpo is a very, very, very solid option to pick up as a high pick. Giannis Antetokounmpo can do everything on the court in terms of production, in terms of efficiency, as well as defense, which is also a very important thing in fantasy. He can produce a lot for your team. He did produce a lot for his team in the previous season, so he most definitely is a very solid pick. And I could even make the argument that I'd pick him over SGA. However, SGA's consistency on offense is staggering. It's like he drops 31 points in every single game, but the reason why I would pick Giannis over SGA is because, yes, SGA can drop 31 points every single game, but Giannis can drop 30 points and get 10 rebounds and also get 5 or 6 assists along with that and maybe a couple of blocks as well. So those are a lot of things that help you in fantasy. So don't be afraid to pick somebody like Giannis Antetokounmpo, or even maybe it was a risk, but I did it last year. I drafted both LeBron and Anthony Davis, and that worked out phenomenally for me. Oh my gosh, my fantasy team last year was ridiculous, and it was very risky. Scotty Barnes straight was a fantastic surprise up until he got hurt, and every other player that I had on the roster, they were able to produce just fine. And even LeBron and Anthony Davis, they were producing at a staggering rate that a lot of people didn't really expect. A lot of people thought, last year at least, when I was drafting, oh, you drafted Anthony Davis, he's going to get hurt. Oh, you drafted LeBron, he's going to get hurt. Oops. But yeah, so Victor Wembanyama, Jokic, Luka, SGA, Giannis Antetokounmpo, those should be the players that you should be searching for if you have a high pick in this draft. And if you can't get any of those players, then you should go last. And you should go last because then you'll start off round 2 with the first pick. So then you can take back-to-back players, which I think is a little bit smarter. So in ESPN's latest mock draft, 8 teams points head-to-head, according to the Steve, the writer of the article. Pau Gasol, what's going on? How have you been? Nice to see you in the chat. Because there are only 8 of the people on Steve's fantasy, he turned and got Scotty Barnes at the end of round 2, which is honestly a fantastic pick. I would have picked Scotty Barnes as well. And then was able to scoop up Kevin Durant with the first pick of round 3. So getting that back-to-back option after by being last in a round is very, very useful and very underrated. So definitely should think about doing that if you cannot get one of the top 5 players that I just listed. Again, the 5 players: Luka Doncic, Victor Wembanyama, Nikola Jokic, SGA, and Giannis Antetokounmpo. Now, point guards. A lot of people, they really think that getting a point guard is necessary and getting assists isn't easy to come by. And to that, I say no. don't bother drafting a point guard early into the round. Try getting other good players at other positions like Sabonis. I had Sabonis, and oh my goodness, his production, his double-doubles were absolutely fantastic. And I benefited more from acquiring bigger players and players that can produce on other sides of the ball that aren't just on the offense, and players that can also get pretty good stats and stuff the stats. And I saved the later rounds for getting a point guard. Again, you don't necessarily need to have a point guard, especially now in today's NBA, because there are so many small forwards and like so many forwards in the NBA that can also stack up assists arguably better than point guards. I mean, there's obviously a select few number of point guards that don't get that many assists. I mean, like Trae Young is definitely one of those players that gets a lot of assists, but I wouldn't personally draft him, and mainly because of the defensive struggles and his inconsistencies. And there are small forwards that get more assists than Steph Curry in a game. So really, you don't necessarily need to pick a point guard early. Point guards are still going to be available late in the round. And I also think Scoot is going to be heading for a pretty nice breakout season this year. So he was averaging 19, 3, and 9, 1 steal, and 2.9 threes in his 7 April games. So he could really be due for a fantastic season coming up. So just keep that in mind. And also another thing, if you are thinking of getting a point guard, Chris Paul is going to be a pretty underrated option in my opinion. Having Victor Wembanyama to throw lobs to, I mean, that is probably like easy 10 assist games right there for Chris Paul. Easy 10 assist games in my opinion. So definitely consider drafting that. Now, in addition to point guards, there are also pretty solid centers that can bring some decent production as well. Jalen Duren is a solid center. Daniel Gafford, Brook Lopez, DeAndre Ayton, Derek Lively II. All of those players are fantastic options at the center and pretty solid options because they can get you the points production and they could also get you the rebounds that you need. Not to mention, I also think Chet Holmgren is a pretty good taker as well. I think he's due for a step up in this season, and he was pretty good last season, but sort of fell off since Victor Wembanyama is Victor Wembanyama. But also, Reed gets a big boost with Karl Anthony Towns wearing a Knicks jersey as well, and I love the idea of grabbing Reed late in the drafts, and so does Steve over here. Now, let's see, what else does what other trends does Steve have? So it can be tricky, however, finding a rather, a solid small forward because in the first few rounds of your draft, because you have Jalen Williams, there's even Jaylen Brown, there's even Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, Jalen Johnson, Mikal Bridges, Miles Bridges, Kuzma, and Franz Wagner. There are so many like late picks that you could pick. I wouldn't draft Kawhi Leonard mainly because he's going to be injured. Same thing with Paul George. I don't really have that much faith in Paul George. I'd actually pick Jaylen Brown if I was to pick anybody on this list, as well as Jalen Williams. So Jaylen Brown and Jalen Williams are a very solid late pick in the NBA, in the fantasy draft, that most likely people aren't going to even think of getting Jaylen Brown because they're going to think Jason Tatum. And he's just going to sort of get swept under the rug, I think, in some of these drafts. But if you can get Jaylen Brown, you have a very solid option at the small forward that comes off the bench. And, excuse me. Now, a question that a lot of people have, however, is in fantasy, who should you draft? Should you draft Jokic at number 1 or Victor at number 1? To that, I say Jokic. Easily, if you have the first pick in the draft, you have to get Jokic. Absolute must. You have to get him. Because Jokic is a triple-double machine. His production, his efficiency, his offense, his ability to get rebounds and assists simultaneously is one of the most valuable things in fantasy basketball. Which is why I also say to get Giannis Antetokounmpo, because he could also do similar things to Nikola Jokic. Just can't really rack up the assist all that much, but he does have it in defense. He makes up for it on the defensive end. However, Jokic's offense is way more consistent than a player's defense because defensive stats are calculated with steals and blocks. And sometimes there are going to be games where Giannis isn't going to get a block or a steal. But there are going to be several games where Jokic gets 26, 10 plus, and 9 plus assists, which ultimately would benefit you more than Giannis Antetokounmpo. So Giannis still in the top 5, but if you have the number 1 pick, you have to absolutely grab Nikola Jokic. And another thing, one thing that makes Victor Wembanyama so valuable is the fact that he averages so many blocks. I think now teams are going to be way more cautious about going into the paint with Victor. We saw that in his rookie year where Christian Braun, he literally was in front of the basket, Victor was behind him, and he did not even attempt to go for the layup because he felt that Victor was going to get that chase down. So really, it's a very solid pick. But again, like, you have to there's a little bit of luck involved with, like, the shot selection that the other team is willing to take on you. And now that everybody knows that you are a well-respected shot blocker, the chances of people going up on you are probably going to be rather slim, especially since he is 7'4". But, excuse me, that's what I have, and those are my opinions. So let's see. What does everybody else, according to this article at least, they all say that you should draft Nikola Jokic at number 1. And there's really no argument for not picking Jokic at number 1. He should definitely be at number 1. So those are some of the fantasy basketball trends. I hope that helps you guys out in your draft success. Again, you got the number 1 pick, get Jokic. If you have a top 5 pick, that's fine. You do have options. If you don't have a top 5 pick, then give up your pick and go last so that way you can go back-to-back for players and get a pretty solid option. That's step number 1. And what was step number 2? I completely forgot what was step number 2. Just remember to draft the players that can produce, that can fill up the box scores, and do it consistently. Because that's really like, don't get stat patters, however. You want to get players that naturally fill up the box scores. Like Nikola Jokic, he naturally fills up the box scores. Giannis Antetokounmpo, he naturally fills up the box scores. Like, the big man position is going to be your friend in a lot of the fantasy drafts. Try to get small forwards that can also accumulate a lot of rebounds. One of the more underrated options, now that I think about it, aside from Tatum, is Paolo Banchero. Honestly, if you vote for him, or not vote for him, excuse me, if you draft him in the later rounds of the draft, that's a pretty solid pick. That's really a very solid pick, because now I feel like he's going to get better, and not only is his rebounding going to get better, his assists are also going to get better, along with his point production. So Paolo Banchero is a very solid option, and I'd actually pick Paolo over somebody like Paul George and somebody like Kawhi Leonard going into this season as well. So just keep those things in mind. Players that can produce efficiently, and players that can play defense. Like, that is a very, very, and remember, efficiency is also very important. So that's all that I have for fantasy basketball, for all of my fantasy basketball fans. And with that out of the way, we can go ahead and go into the 5th and the final segment, where I talk about the WNBA playoff games that are set to start, that are set to go on later tonight. So I'll be talking about that right after this short break, so be sure to stay tuned.